My my request to all the participants will be that while you keep your audio muted, please keep your video on so that we have the feeling of sitting in a conference all together. Thank you. Thank you for listening to me, Supreet ji. I hope everyone else also listens and turns their video on.
Professor Sen is also joined.
Yes. Welcome, Professor Sen. You are muted, sir. Kindly unmute yourself.
Let me know when I should start. I think it's at 2:15 IST. Is that right?
Yes, sir. We are starting in a couple of minutes.
Should I share my presentation just to make sure it works?
Please, sir, please do that. We will check from our end. Participants are requested to turn their video on while keeping their audio muted.
Can you see my screen?
The presentation we can.
Yeah, sorry. Can you see my screen? Sorry, I can't hear you.
That your screen is visible.
Yes, sir, we can see.
Yes, sir, we can see. Okay.
Your screen is.
Okay, so I think you can see my screen, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. Good. So let me
Sir.
know when I should start speaking. Thanks.
Yes, you can see the presentation. Participants, please turn their on and audio muted. Ivana, sir. Yes, take a chair. I request all participants to please turn their video on and keep their audio muted. Please start. Dr. Partha, I think we should start now.
Yes, please.
So, With the permission of Professor Sen, I will start the webinar. A very good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ruchira, and on behalf of the National Institute of Rural Development and Panchayati Raj New Delhi, I extend a warm welcome to all the dignitaries who have joined here today for our fourth webinar of Evidence-Based Policy and Action Roundtable. Today's webinar focuses on the 8th SDG goal, that is a decent work and economic growth. For this, we are pleased to have with us Professor Kunal Sen, Director of United Nations University, World Institute for Development Economics Research, who will be speaking on good job challenges in developing countries. Today's webinar will be chaired by Dr. Partha Pratim Sahu, who is jointly coordinating this webinar and is an associate professor at the Center for Entrepreneurship Development and Financial Inclusion. We welcome all the invited experts for the consultation, including my colleagues, scholars, enthusiasts, and functionaries of rural development, and my beloved students. I request Dr. Partha Sahu to introduce our honorable speaker to the audience, and I will hand over the mic. Dr. Sahu, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Ruchira. I again welcome Professor Sen on behalf of NIRDPR. And I also thank him for accepting our invitation. And I will give a very brief introduction. Many of you must be familiar about him and his work. So Professor Sen currently is the director of UNU Wider Helsinki and also a professor of development economics at the Global Development Institute, University of Manchester. Professor Sen is a leading international expert on the political economy of growth, development, and he has done extensive research on international finance, political economy, determinants of inclusive growth, dynamics of poverty, social inclusion, female labor participation rate, and informal sector in developing economies. And you will find a lot of books on all of these areas, and his works not only limited to South Asian country, but also in relation to East Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Some of his very eminent work, excellent books that we have seen, The Political Economy of India's Growth episode 2016, The Process of Financial Liberalization in 1997, The Economic Risk, The Perspective of Policy Reform, and he is also on the advisory board, editorial board of many eminent international and national journals. And he has written maybe close to 100 peer review journal articles which have been appeared in all reputed journal. And in addition to his work as a professor of development economics, he has been leading a lot of global research projects and on the advisory role to many multilateral and bilateral agencies and also UN organizations like ESID and ADB and UK Department of UK DFID, etc., etc. And he has also been awarded Sanjay Lal Prize, the 2006, and Dudley Sear Prize in 2003 for his publication and excellent contribution to the development work. And I again thank on my personal behalf, and I have been following his work since 2012, where we met in Thrissur, Kerala. And on several occasions, I have got the opportunity to present my work. And many of the friends, colleagues who have joined, they will agree with me that in addition to his contribution to the research field, he has been inspiring, encouraging, and playing a role of mentor to many young research scholars, including me. So I thank again, and over to Professor Sen, please.
Thank you, Partha. Thank you, Ruchira, for the very nice introductions and also for inviting me to speak in the fourth webinar of Evidence-Based Policy and Action Roundtable series. And I'll be speaking on SDG 8, Decent Work and Economic Growth. And I will be speaking essentially what the SDG 8 is about, the goods job challenge in developing countries. And so that will be my presentation. Let me now begin to speak about, to provide a context behind why are we talking about this particular topic and why is SDG 8 so important. All SDGs are, all the SDGs are important, but this one is particularly important, especially for those who work on economic development. So we know that there is this major problem that's happening in developing countries, especially in Africa and South Asia, I would say, and to some extent Latin America. Perhaps not as important, not as relevant in East Asia. One could note that. So in most parts of the developing world, except East Asia, there's a jobs crisis. Very few jobs that pay well, high rates of informality, large gender gaps in productive jobs. Women are more likely to be in poorly paid or unpaid jobs. This is a set of stylized facts that I think perhaps we are all familiar with. And this probably is one of the reasons why decent work is an important goal of Agenda 2030 of the United Nations. Sustainable Development Goal 8, and just to read out what the goal is about: promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. Clearly, in this particular SDG goal, as you can see from this statement, there are three important features of the goal. One is sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, of course. But second is also full and productive employment. Everyone who wants to work should be able to work in productive jobs. And third should be decent work for all. In other words, not only should we be working in jobs, but also jobs that pay well. So that's also important to keep in mind in this SDG 8. Moving forward, what I'll do in my lecture is to just set the stage on the goods job challenge. Perhaps this is well known, but perhaps it's important to understand where we're coming from on this particular question. And then why is there a deficit in good jobs and what can be done about it? So first is what exactly is the problem that we're looking at in Asia, Africa, and Latin America? And then why do we have this problem? And then possible policy solutions to address this problem. I'm going to draw a lot from the work that we've been doing in UNE Wider. As Patham mentioned, we are a think tank based in Helsinki, a research think tank, and also United Nations agency. So we are part of course, this discussion around SDG, all the SDGs, and SDG 8 is one of the very important SDGs we're working on at this point. So if you were to go to our website, and if you see under our work, if you look at the tab, you'll see a set of projects on transforming economies, and most of them, if not all, are on SDG 8. And I mentioned some of them here, but there are several other projects also. The ones that I mentioned here is a set of a very important project on informality, transforming informal work and livelihoods. We have a book coming out soon from Oxford University Press, and also there will be a special issue in the Journal of Development Studies, also out early next year. So we have two major publications, one Oxford University Press book, and secondly, a special issue of articles in the Journal of Development Studies. But there's several other papers there. And if you look at our website there, you'll see many of the working papers that will form the part of the book or the journal special issue. We also have created this year a major database on good jobs, sectoral employment and value added. It was not there before. That is why we made it a priority to create this database. It has 51 low-income and middle-income countries, including India, of course, and other South Asian countries. It is so Nepal, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. But it is really important because there wasn't really a reliable data on employment and value-added productivity in low-income countries, middle-income countries, till we made an effort to get this data set out. And it is very reliable because it's been done with the Groningen Growth and Development Center. And for those of you know the work the data we all use, the Payne World tables, national income accounts, the input-output tables, and this database all comes from the same place. That's the Groningen Growth and Development Center, and they are seen as the most reliable on economic data. Then there's another project which I will also, if you're interested, you should look at it. It's on women's work, roots of economic and social empowerment. And this is important because, as I will mention in my presentation, there are major gender gaps in employment and earnings, and this is something that we need to address. And this is not only this particular project, not only is about SDG 8, it's also about SDG 5 on gender equality. Okay, moving on. Setting the stage. So what are we talking about? So one of the things that one needs to understand is that most of the workers in the developing world are in the informal economy. I just cite here the World Economic Report 2019, but there are many other documents that you can look at, for example, from the ILO. And 2 out of every 3 workers in emerging economies are in the informal economy. You can see that clearly Here, especially workers employed informally. In other words, they don't have social protection, they don't have pensions, they don't have labor rights, and so on. I mean, you know the definition of informality that's in there from the ILO, and that's pretty clear. So, so you can see that, and you can see in some countries it's quite a bit. For example, Nepal is almost every worker working informally. Niger, Cote d'Ivoire, Nicaragua, and then there are countries such as Peru, Moldova, and so on, where it's less. But you can see even for Peru and Tunisia, for example, it's still around 50%, half the workers. It's quite a lot. So that's something quite remarkable that we are in a world where most workers, especially in the global south, are working informally. And if you look at the share of informal employment, and in the darker bars, which is higher on informal employment, you can see they are quite concentrated in parts of the world, which we probably we know about. In Africa, you can see 90% and over are informally employed, including agriculture. And in Asia and South Asia, it's around 75%, 89%, but very high rates of informality. In Latin America, you can see it's slightly less in some of the countries, but even there, it's between 50 to 74% in many of the countries. And of course, not surprisingly, you don't see much informal employment in North America, Australia, New Zealand, and obviously Western Europe. That's not surprising, and also much less in the former Soviet Union. So that's interesting. Even if you explore agriculture, you might say, well, actually, many of the workers in Africa and Asia are in agriculture, and agriculture by its nature is almost always informal, right? So if you take out agriculture, does it make a difference? But not really. I mean, even there, if you exclude agriculture, you can still see that quite a bit of workers outside of agriculture are still employed informally. And that's really important to keep in mind. Agriculture is not the main reason why we see high rates of informal employment. So 2 billion of the world's employed population, age 15 and over, work informally, representing 61.2% of global employment. Excluding agriculture, the global level of informal employment falls to 50.5%, but non-agricultural informal employment remains high in 3 regions: Africa, the Arab states, and Asia and the Pacific. That's the TAREX fact. Moving on, and then what I mentioned was the gender dimension of informality. Now, there's a very nice paper. I'm actually one of the co-authors. I shouldn't, step on this, but it is a very nice paper, and I was really very lucky to work with some excellent co-authors here. We have put a paper together on vulnerable employment and gender. And what we could do is we could actually look at microdata, in other words, unit record data, for many countries in the world. There was a data set that we managed to get obtain access to for the World Bank. And using that, we could use the ILO definition of vulnerable employment, which is own account workers and contributing family workers. And we could consistently use the definition to obtain vulnerable employment measures for a lot of countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and including also obviously East Asia. And if you look at this, and we have created also a fact sheet on this on gender and employment. Again, it's available on our website. The fact sheet. It's if you look at the project on women's work, it is there. And I think I'll encourage you to take a look at the fact sheet, because it's together in one place. So if you look at share of vulnerable employment, total employment, female, you can see that some of the regions are extremely high vulnerable employment. So you can see for Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, it's close to 90%. Quite remarkable, really. And of course, it is also interesting to note that in some regions, it's quite low. So Latin America, it's less than 40% and in declining. And you also see the same thing that's happening in East Asia. So we can see there are really quite remarkable regional differences in vulnerable employment by gender. South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa do pretty badly. And pretty badly is not pretty badly, it's very badly. Because if you have 90% of all women employment in vulnerable employment, that's really quite remarkably, that's quite remarkable in itself. And then we have a few regions where it seems to be that women are not in vulnerable employment. That is, they are not own account workers, they're contributing family workers. They are in paid employees or sometimes also employers. So the gender gap in the share of informal employment, in total employment, including agriculture, again, you can see big differences across the continent, across the continents. And again, we've already seen that. We can see that in some regions, women's informal employment is much higher than men. And this, of course, includes India, as you can see, the green areas. And you can see, again, most of it is concentrated in Africa and Asia. It seems to be much of the problem is in Africa and Asia, less so Latin America. In fact, Latin America, in fact, it's less obvious there is a gender problem in terms of informal employment. So that's also interesting that we have the problem is mostly in two continents or two regions, South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, and also Middle East and North Africa to some extent. Now, one thing to keep in mind when we talk about good jobs, it's important to keep in mind that there's really one sector that provides good jobs, really one sector. There are other sectors which provide high pay, but they don't really provide too many jobs. So if you look at this particular graph, you can see that the one sector that does not provide good jobs is pretty obvious, is agriculture. Unfortunately, agriculture is the sector which is giving the most number of jobs in Africa and in Asia, South Asia. So you can look at agriculture, and that's agriculture is here in this particular rectangle, orange colored. You can see a lot of jobs, but very poorly paid and very low productivity jobs. And then you have the non-tradable services. What are they? Non-tradable services, restaurants and so on, street vendors. And again, they are obviously more productive in agriculture, but they're not very productive. And then you move along this way, and you can see there are non-market services, and then manufacturing, and non-manufacturing, and then tradable services. Tradable services in Indian context, it's IT, for example, right? Now, tradable services is extremely productive, the most productive sector. But tradable services does not provide too many jobs. Now, it could change, of course, but at this point, it is not the sector which will provide a lot of jobs, which are highly paid. The sector that provides the most jobs that are highly paid is manufacturing. And that's something that one has to keep in mind, that no matter what we want to think about, but the good job challenge, if you don't have a vibrant manufacturing sector in your own country, you are constrained by how much good jobs you can provide. That's important to keep in mind. Notwithstanding, there may be jobs available in tradable services. Now, non-manufacturing industries, depends on whether you have mining in your country or not. And that, many countries don't have natural resources. And also you might even argue that those jobs may be productive, but how many jobs can you create in mining, for example? Nor is it perhaps advisable to have too much of mining industries in your own country, because they have other implications on environmental pollution and so on. So I don't necessarily think non-manufacturing industries is the way to go, but manufacturing and maybe tradable services also might be possibilities of where you can would be possible of creating good jobs. Okay, now looking at manufacturing, just understand one thing about manufacturing, which is I think really important for us, especially in the Indian context, that while we have seen manufacturing shares decline in Latin America has been going through what is called deindustrialization for some time now. Premature, actually. They shouldn't have been deindustrializing so quickly. You can see that. You can see, so if you look at the left side of the figure, you can see it's been declining. Sub-Saharan Africa, in our data set, we find there's been a resurgence in manufacturing, not a lot, but a little bit. That's very encouraging. Now, developing Asia, this is like we haven't broken this down by South Asia and East Asia, but much of this increase is happening because of East Asia. But in South Asia, there's one country that is also industrializing, and that's Bangladesh. Not any other country in South Asia. But Bangladesh, along with East Asia, so East Asia is here, China, Thailand, Malaysia, Laos, PDR, Cambodia, and so on, there we see the manufacturing employment as a share of total employment is increasing quite steadily, and that also is reflecting the manufacturing real value added shares. So if you look around the world, the developing world, you see quite different patterns. Latin America, manufacturing jobs are being lost over time. Sub-Saharan Africa, a little bit of an increase more recently in the 2000s. And in developing Asia, it has been increasing, but as I was saying, mostly concentrated in East Asia and in Bangladesh in South Asia. Now, I want to now spend a little bit of time trying to, some of this work I've been doing, and it follows from, as Parker mentioned, my interest in informality. I've been working in informal employment for a long time. Some of you might have seen my Oxford University Press book that came out some time back now, a few years back, on Indian informal sector. And so, you know, and you've seen, I mean, I published many, many papers now on informality. My most recent paper that I published on India came out in EPW, and I'll talk a little bit about that paper. It came out earlier this year. And I wanted, in this work I've been doing, I'm quite excited about it actually. I've been able to, you know, informality as a concept is like a black box. I mean, especially in India, where pretty much everyone is into the informal sector. And we were trying to find a way to schematize informal employment in different ways, to put it into different boxes, so to speak, or different ways to think about informal employment. And here we've been very much influenced by Gary Field's work. Gary Fields is the leading labor economist working on developing countries, and Gary was very important in this project that we were doing. And what I want to just put in front of you, and I think for especially of those of you who are working on this topic in your PhDs or or you're writing papers on this is a very useful way to think of informality, in my view. So if you think about the working age population, the working age population can be either employed, unemployed, out of the labor force. That's standard labor economics, right? But then out of that, there may be some who are self-employed, and there's some who are wage employed. And that's the important distinction: self-employment versus wage employment. In India, we call self-employment, but we often use the word own account workers. And then, of course, wage employment is pretty obvious. You're working for a wage, whether in the formal sector or the informal sector. And then among those who are self-employed, there are those who are formal and those who are informal. In the wage employed, again, there who are formally wage employed and those who are informally wage employed. That part is perhaps quite well known. But the part that is not so well known, and it's really useful in the Indian context, is there are, even in the informal sector, there are different tiers. There are upper tier informal and there are lower tier informal. The upper tier self-employed informal, there are lower tier self-employed informal. There are upper tier wage employed informal, there are lower tier wage employed informal. And that's important because the informal sector is not a homogeneous sector by any such imagination. We need to look at heterogeneity of the informal sector. And these are really, really important distinctions to keep both conceptual and in an empirical sense. And I'll show you how we try to implement this six-way work status classification for the Indian labor market. But just to be clear about the fact that we're looking at 6 work status. And so what are the 6 work status? Formally self-employed, formally wage employed, upper tier informally self-employed, lower tier informally self-employed, upper tier informally wage employed, lower tier informally wage employed. 6. Okay. So you can imagine any worker in any European country labor market could be classified broadly in these 6 things. Of course, there are workers who, in a family, there'll be somebody who's self-employed, somebody who's wage employed. That happens, of course. We know that it's very common. A worker might be more, working part-time for a wage and then also having his or her own business. That also happens. So it's not like a completely mutually exclusive categories. But by and large, this is useful to start thinking about the labor market in India and other developing countries. So moving on. So now that we try to implement this work status classifications for India. I will not get into how we did it because that's in the EPW paper and that will take too much time. But it's very straight, and I can answer this in the Q&A discussion exactly how. But when we do this, we have a very interesting, we see something very interesting here. Now, the other thing that was important for me to do in this work that we are doing in a wider project on informality is the question that I was always struggling with when I was working informally in India, like how many workers from the lower tier informal move into the upper tier informal or even the formal. And we didn't really have an answer to that because we need panel data for that. And we could use the Indian Human Development Survey, the IHDS data set, where we have 2 rounds of panel data. And we could then look at questions of mobility, which is really important. Because at the end of the day, we want to know how many workers move out. Or, in fact, how many workers fall from where they were in a higher level job to a lower level job. These are really important. And so we could get the panel data, and this is basically working with the panel data now. in this particular data set that we had, which is it's a very rich data set. So here, just looking at the 2 rounds we have, 2005, 2012, we don't have anything more recent than 2012. I believe there's a new round of data collection going on, but that has not been released. If you look at the number of workers in each of the categories, the 6 categories, you can see that there's hardly any worker who are formal self-employed. And then we have a large number of workers who are informal self-employed. I mean, a best example of informal self-employed, street vendors. And in India, of course, we know there's a large number of workers who are street vendors. Upper tier self-employed are essentially self-employed who are hiring workers outside the family. In the Indian kind of, if any of you work in NSS data, it's called NDMEs or DMEs. So that's upper tier in self-employed, informal self-employed. And then formal wage employed, 9.2%, a little bit larger than the formal self-employed. And then, of course, again, this big group of workers who are upper tier informal wage employed and lower tier informal wage employed. Lower tier informal wage employed in India, best example is if you're agricultural laborer or if you're a construction worker, which are the absolutely the lower end of the pecking order in the Indian labor market. So again, you see big numbers of workers in India who are lower tier informal wage employed or lower tier informal self-employed. In fact, together, that's about 50% of the labor market. When we look at the 2012 data, we don't see big differences there, except that we seem to see, if anything, the number of workers in the upper tier informal wage employed is actually less than 2005. And there's been a large increase in the lower tier informal wage employed, gone up from 31.6 to 37.6%, which is quite worrying because in this period, economic growth was quite rapid. Now, moving on. So what are I'm going to go through this very quickly because you can look at the DPW paper. What do we know about the workers in these different categories? So very, very quickly. And because most of it, I would be surprised if you didn't know what would be the story here. We know that those who are in the lower tier informal employed, many of them are women. So there's a big gender issue here on informal employment in India. Many of them are women. Less so in the case of wage employed. We also know that when it comes to where they're located, urban, rural, informal lower tier wage employed are mostly all in rural areas. In fact, it's 99.9%. So that's again interesting. Again, not surprising that if you are in the lower tier informal labor market, you're almost surely going to have very little schooling, no schooling. And in fact, if you see the lower tier informal wage employed, more than half have no schooling. On the other hand, if you have secondary or higher education, you're more likely to be in the formal self-employed or the formal wage employed, or even the upper tier informal self-employed. So education is a big divide here. If you don't have schooling, more likely to be in the lower tier of the informal jobs. If you have secondary schooling and higher education, you're in the higher end of the labor market. And that's not too surprising to know. We also see a very important divide by caste or scheduled caste, scheduled tribes. About 64% of total workers in the lower tier informal wage employed are scheduled caste, scheduled tribes. And 45% of lower tier informal employed are scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, much more than the proportion in the population. So there's a gender issue, and then there's a issue around ethnicity too, caste and tribe. And that's something, again, quite worrying. And then, of course, just the opposite of that, if you're forward caste, you're more likely to be in the formal self-employed or in the formal wage employed. That's really, so these are things that are telling us that behind what we see in the labor market in India, there are also social divides that are driving what we see. And that's important. Gender and ethnicity are the divides here, apart from education and location. Important to understand. Okay, so moving on, the question of transition. So the question of transition, who moves and who's likely to be able to move, either up or move down. Again, I'll go through this very quickly because it's, again, this is pretty obvious. If you're in the lower tier part of the labor market, especially if you're wage employed, it's going to be very unlikely you're going to move up. You're stuck. So you can see here in this particular rectangle, those who are in the lower tier wage employed, lower tier informal wage employed, more than 70%, the next time 7 years, 2005, 2012, 7 years later, are still a lower tier informal wage employed. Hardly any chance of moving up at all. On the lower tier informal self-employed, there is again similar kind of clustering. They're very unlikely to move up, but there's a little bit more mobility there. A little bit more mobility. In other words, it's possible something might become upper tier self-employed, or even sometimes even formal self-employed. Not much, but you can see there's a little bit here of those who become formal self-employed. But of course, again, you see a large proportion who are stuck in the same kind of job. It's interesting to notice that if you're formal wage employed, which is this one here, formal wage employed, this one here, you're not going to move down. And if you think about the kind of work, those who are in the formal wage employed, working in public sector bank, public sector enterprises and so on, or work in the private sector in well-paid jobs, it's very unlikely that they will move down. And so it's not surprising we see stickiness. So what is happening here is in the Indian labor market, there's a stickiness on both the upper end and the lower end. The upper end, you're likely to stay on where you are, and the lower end, you're likely to stay on where you are. In the middle of the distribution, in the work status classification, there's more churning, more mobility. Okay, and that's really interesting. Okay, moving. So I just want to, maybe just go very quickly that we also did by gender and location, and I just want to say that again we see differences between men and women in movements up and down. You can see here, you can see there's a little bit of more women who are stuck in lower tier informal wage employed compared to men. So there is a gender difference there. When it comes to self-employment, also we see some differences there. We can see this one here versus this one here. There's also a bit of a difference. So women are more likely to be stuck in lower tier jobs. Location, of course, again, we see more mobility in the cities, urban areas than in the rural areas. And again, I'm not going to speak too much about that because that's pretty obvious. Now, the other thing we could do in this work we were doing, looking at the Indian labor market, we can also look at the job ladder. And this is one thing that's going to be part of the book that you're doing right now. The book is itself called the job ladder. So the job ladder is telling us, if I'm an informal worker, lower tier informal worker, how much am I being paid versus somebody in the formal sector? And how steep is the gradient? Is it very steep or is it relatively flat? And you can see in India, it's pretty steep. And the steepness is kind of a little bit less pronounced at 112, but nevertheless, it's pretty steep. If you're formal wage employed, far better off than anybody else in the Indian labor market. And if you're lower tier or lower tier wage employed, you can see that in the job ladder, you're right at the bottom. That's not surprising, but what is surprising to me is the gradient, how sharp the gradient is, right? And so obviously, simply, hypothetically, if you could move from here up here, just if that's possible, you can imagine the big increase that happens in your livelihoods. Of course, that's extremely unlikely. We already saw that in the previous transition matrix. But if you could, it would be a big increase in your livelihood. Or even if you could move from here to about somewhere here, right? So it tells us the big income gains if you could make the transition out of the lower tier jobs to the upper tier jobs or even the formal sector jobs. And again, this is just very difficult to read perhaps because this is using multi-logic models and looking at probabilities of what are the correlates of transition, correlates, not causal, difficult to do causal estimates here. And, caste is important, education is important, age is important, and so on. None of this is too surprising. And you can, again, take a look at the APW paper and see exactly how the magnitudes on each of these categories. So let me now go into the deficit question. Why is a deficit of good jobs? And there are four main causes. One is basically about globalization, technology, lack of human capital, policy distortions. So if you look at the literature on why is there a problem of good jobs, basically the literature kind of says these are the four big causes, the big buckets. And of course, there's a debate going on which one is more important, and there's no clear answer to that. So I'll just go take you through what the arguments are for each of these four big drivers, without necessarily saying that that we know for sure which one is the most important. My view is that all of them are important, actually. Okay, so globalization. So globalization, the thing is that this is the work of Danny Roderick, that there has been this premature deindustrialization. Especially trade integration has led to situation manufacturing in many parts of the global south has been badly hit. So industrial employment has been falling in many developing countries much earlier than historical norms. And in today's rich countries, workers first move from agriculture to manufacturing and then on to services. That was the classic path you've seen in Western Europe and the US, and also in Japan, for example, and Korea actually also, Korea and Taiwan. But this is no longer the case in the low-income world. Workers are moving right away from agriculture to services and into low productivity services, non-tradable services. So that's a real problem. That's one fundamental difference between what used to be the case before versus what's the case now. This is particularly true in Africa and South Asia, particularly true in Africa and South Asia. So that's the whole challenge here. That globalization has made it more difficult for countries to take their workers out of agriculture for the poorly paid jobs in agriculture into manufacturing because of premature deindustrialization. So the effects of globalization are fairly clear. Countries that do not have an innate advantage in manufacturing lose out to import competition. If you're not really competitive in manufacturing, once you open up your remove your trade barriers, you're in trouble. Countries that have an advantage in manufacturing benefit from export orientation. So the regions that are losing out right now are Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. Regions that are gaining are East and South Asia, but there again, I will need to be careful because in South Asia, there is a difference between, say, Bangladesh versus Nepal, for example, or Pakistan. In South Asia, most of the gains have happened in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. Sri Lanka a bit earlier, because Sri Lanka liberalized much earlier, but more recently Bangladesh. Okay, so PLC deindustrialization graphically is very obvious. What you can see from this is that before the 1990s, you peaked your manufacturing employment share peaked much later in terms of, so you got richer, you became rich, and then it started declining, the employment share of manufacturing. But what's happening? The red line is telling us that that's happening much earlier. So even before you became a high-income country, you're starting to lose workers in manufacturing, and this is basically telling us that this is first by employment, and then by output. The employment ones, I think, are much more revealing. You can see that the peak that happened in manufacturing employment for the richer countries was somewhere here much later than the peak now. And I think that's according to Danny Roderick, because of globalization. As many of the countries in Africa and Asia and even Latin America are not able to withstand import competition, the manufacturing sectors, and that's why they're contracting. So that's something that is, there are debates about to what extent is something that is true across the board. Are there countries that are not fitting this kind of trend? What are the drivers of premature deindustrialization? I have a paper, part of the Economic Transformation Database project, which you can take a look at, where we present some evidence that that's not completely true now, that there is a little bit of a shift happening in Africa to mass manufacturing. So, there's a big debate about this. Numbers are obviously up for debate, and the causes are also up for debate. But this is a really exciting area of research, actually. And if you look at then by region, again, you can see that developing Asia, which includes East Asia, there's been an increase in manufacturing employment shares when you control for everything else. These are conditional employment shares. And you can see the same things happened a little bit in Sub-Saharan Africa. So that's encouraging up to the 2010s. While in Latin America and in developed Asia, it's been falling, and developed Asia is falling because they are rich countries now. Latin America is a bit surprising because they're not that rich. There are very few high-income countries. So that's a bit surprising. But developing Asia, I should say, there is a differentiation between South Asia to some extent, and within South Asia and East Asia. Okay. Technology. This is a big debate happening now. Automation. Is it leading to loss of jobs and occupations which can be routinized? which can be computerized, like production workers and clerical workers. And, people are arguing, yes, that's going on right now. So that makes it even more difficult for low-income countries to compete, because the industry which they were actually competitive in, slowly computers, automation is taking over. So this figure which I got from a particular document, which is Edward Glaser's work, who's a urban economist in the US, that in the future the process of automation innovation will shape employment. So what we might see is that automation will lead to jobs being lost in the old sectors, but there may be new sectors opening up with new employment. That's the innovation part. So automation might be making it more difficult to create jobs in old sectors like garments, for example, electronics. But innovation is going to create jobs in new sectors, especially sectors which need cognitive skills. And that's a really interesting question. But the problem there is that for most low-income, middle-income countries, they are mostly their economic activity is mostly bunched in the old sectors. They don't have too much economic activity in the new sectors. But the new sectors are mostly located, not surprisingly, in the US and Europe and so on. So there is this problem, this challenge that automation is leading to jobs being lost, particularly in the old sectors, and the old sectors are mostly located in low and middle-income countries. Innovation is leading to jobs being created in new sectors, but new sectors are mostly located in the Western European countries and the US and so on, and Japan and so on. So this is the contradiction we are finding right now. And technology is creating high-skilled jobs, but destroying middle and low-skilled jobs. And you can see this from this particular graph that, in fact, high-skilled jobs, there has been an increase in many countries, including in developing countries. While we can see from here, in low-skilled jobs, low-skilled occupations, jobs are being lost. So you can see high-skilled jobs, Bolivia, Zambia, and so on and so forth. You can see jobs being created, but in low-skilled jobs or middle-skilled jobs, occupations, jobs are being lost. So what it's doing is that it's creating more inequality in a country, because the high-skilled workers, college educated and so on, are the ones who are getting more jobs and getting higher wages. But the low-skilled workers and the middle-skilled workers, like workers in the factory, for example, which are the middle-skilled workers, are the ones who are losing out and losing their jobs. So that's a really interesting phenomenon, which is driving inequality both across the world, across country, but also within country. And that's something it's quite a remarkable phenomenon that technology is doing right now. Technology is giving a lot of possibilities for new jobs being created, but also destroying a lot of jobs. And in fact, in this graph here, again, this is in the World Development Report 2019, you can see that what has happened is that the rate of technology diffusion has just been increasing and increasing. So the curve, which is capturing technology diffusion, is essentially sharply increasing, and that's really quite worrying in one sense. That technology diffusion is to happen slowly, the slow rate before, and this we just look at over time. And then we get to the 1990s and 2000s, and then we start seeing major technology diffusion. There's some examples here of the first start of business process outsourcing in India, 2002. And we know then how big the sector grew in India. WeChat Pay was introduced in China in 2013. Again, that created so many new transactions, electronic transactions, so on. We can see that. We can see many examples that in India itself, how quickly technology has been diffused in India. Now, that's a good thing, as I was saying, it's creating new jobs, but it's also a bad thing. And that's something we need to worry about. And bad, especially for low-skilled workers. Okay, third big driver, human capital. There's been impressive achievements in getting children to school in the developing world. There's been no doubt, India is also part of the story. There's been a lot of kids now going to school, including girls. And I think that's been a very encouraging sign. Children are going to school, not necessarily to secondary school, but at least to primary school. And one may argue that's the most important. But the other problem then is that you get the children to school, as has happened in India, but schooling and learning. What are they learning in school? And we know that in India is a major problem with learning, major problem in learning. Children who are in high levels of the schools are not learning maths, not learning any other verbal skills, so on. So when they come out of the school into the labor market, they don't have the skills. And so technology has increased the demand for high order general cognitive skills, such as complex problem solving, critical thinking, advanced communication, but that are transferable across jobs, but cannot be acquired through schooling alone. That's not the problem. Many of these kind of new skills, which are called cognitive skills, cannot be just done in schooling itself. And that's why tertiary education, vocational training is very important for the jobs of tomorrow. And India has had a huge challenge in providing good quality vocational training and good quality tertiary education. So there is this challenge now that even schooling, which is important, what used to be an important driver of human capital formation, is not enough. Both because you're not learning enough in school, and second of all, because the skills you need for the jobs of tomorrow are not only learned in schools. They're learned in higher education institutions, but also in the jobs themselves. And this is a problem that many countries in the developing world are facing. If you look at the Human Capital Index, which is the measure the World Bank put together very nicely, and you can see that a bunch of countries are here we know about, almost all in East Asia, apart from the ones in, obviously the Germany and United States are all there, but you have Hong Kong, Singapore, Korea, and so on. And then you look at here, and you see here, almost all are in Sub-Saharan Africa. India figures somewhere here, which is pretty bad. That India's Human Capital Index is lower than Guatemala, Egypt, Indonesia, Dominican Republic, Lebanon, and so on. So India is doing pretty badly, actually. I mean, we shouldn't be comparing India with Mozambique or Liberia and Niger. I mean, these are conflict-affected countries or moving out of conflict very recently. India should be compared with countries in this space. And India is doing pretty badly, the Human Capital Index. It's the way to measure productivity of human capital, essentially. So that's quite a remarkable finding for India, too. Okay, policy distortions. Now, one of the things that's important to understand that, the reason we see high informality is not because there aren't enough good jobs in the manufacturing sector or the tradable service sector, but also because of bad policy choices. And this is something important to keep in mind. So the reason we see highest informality in many developing countries is because of a poor policy environment. Not only, but one important cause. So many policies are well-intentioned, but end up making the problem worse. An example, and this is particularly true in Latin America. Policymakers provide non-contributory social insurance to informal workers, but impose contributory social insurance to formal firms and workers. So Latin America, if you are in the informal sector, the government provides social insurance. But the moment you move to the formal sector firm has to, or the formal employee has to then contribute social insurance. Well, what does it do? Basically, firms say, okay, I'm sorry, I'm not going to hire all these workers on payroll, and often find ways to hire them informally because they want to contribute to their social insurance. Workers themselves say, okay, I don't want to make a contribution to my pension. If I can get the government to do it, I would rather work informally. So that itself leads to a situation that is a tax on the formal sector and a subsidy to the informal sector. And no wonder Latin America, we start seeing high risk informality, even for countries which actually which are fairly middle income countries, so on. So it's not surprising we see high informality when really the problem really is poor policy choices and poor policy and policy distortions. So it leads to workers and firms choosing low productivity informal sector and moving on to the high productivity formal sector. So we should not ignore this, because there is a tendency to think of informality is purely because, not of choice, but because of the fact that workers cannot get better jobs. And that's true. That's true. But in many contexts, it's because they choose to be in the informal sector because they want to, because it is in their benefit not to be in the formal sector. And that's very sad. It's very sad if a policy environment that creates this kind of distortion. And that's something we need to think about. So good jobs become a reality in the economy. There's very good work by Santiago Levy, who gave our annual lecture in WIDER 2019, where he makes this argument for Mexico. And Mexico is not our outlier. Mexico is the kind of problem which in Mexico happens in many other countries, particularly in Latin America. Okay, so what can be done about it? So first, how to engage with the globalized world? Well, there may be possibilities, and we have been working on this question for a long time in wider. There may be possibilities of thinking about if manufacturing is a problem, then maybe there are industries without smokestacks, agri-processing, tourism, which countries can do better in if they can't compete in manufacturing. So that's point number one. Okay. Point number two is that even in conventional manufacturing, there's still room to maneuver. Ethiopia is a good example. It's a picture of Ethiopian company in one of the Ethiopian export processing zones. That there's still space out there. If you can make sure you're competitive, and if you can make sure you provide a good policy environment for the manufacturing companies in your country, you can still compete. May not be in the same scale as China, of course. That's obvious, but you can still compete. There's enough space in the world markets for manufacturing from low cost producers. And of course, it's important to keep in mind that the government, the state has to be providing a facilitating environment for the private sector. The synergistic state-business relations is crucial to economic development trajectories. That's often forgotten because the state often gets in the way. The state doesn't provide the environment that the private sector can thrive. Because manufacturing cannot be done, of course, by the state alone. In fact, we have moved away from nationalized industries in most countries now. So clearly, the state has to encourage the private sector to grow, and in many ways. Then the next thing is technology. So technology is something that I think is an opportunity in many countries, and we should look at it as an opportunity and yes, a possible threat. So digital technology is providing a new route to economic prosperity for many developing countries, making services easier to trade by creating forms of communication that make remote workers seem less remote. I mean, for example, we're seeing now in the Pacific Islands, for example, because of technology, the Pacific Islands were completely cut off from trade in manufacturing because of the locations they were in. But we're seeing increasingly some examples of technology allowing them to compete in tradable services, like banking, for example. And services may be the new manufacturing. We have a paper by Richard Baldwin and a co-author. Richard Baldwin gave one of the keynote lectures in the wider annual conference in 2019. And it's a really interesting argument that maybe we should think of services as the new manufacturing because of digital technologies. And therefore, we should not get so worried if manufacturing, the conventional manufacturing, is not doing so well. I'm not necessarily saying that's true for every case. I still think manufacturing is pretty important, but I think there are debates, there are interesting questions coming about new kind of services, which we should think about. Moving on, human capital. Well, I mean, this is again, I think so obvious, but so sad to see so many countries do not do something about it. You got to invest in early childhood education programs. Children actually learn a lot in the very first few years of their schooling or even preschooling. And if you don't invest in early childhood education programs, maybe it's too late by the time they become 10, 12, or even later. So you've got to make sure that you invest in early childhood education programs and have very, very good early childhood education programs, including at the nursery level. And you also have to think of the other side. How do you facilitate adult learning as new jobs open up? New skills are important. Old jobs are no longer viable. Old skills are no longer important. How do you try to rework your adult workforce to embrace new jobs? That's a really very important question. So that's also something that I think many countries have not thought through very well. And then to reform outdated vocational training programs. In India is a good example of this. We have pretty outdated vocational training programs. We just haven't been doing something about it as yet. And you can, this figure, it's important to just again to look at. In many countries, children from disadvantaged backgrounds are the least likely to attend early childhood education programs. In other words, it seems that even more so the problem is for the disadvantaged children from disadvantaged backgrounds. They're not able to access early childhood education programs. So it tells you that why, for example, investing in early childhood education programs, it's very important also to do something which actually addresses inequality in your country. Because these children who are not able to access early childhood education programs are not going to be able to survive in the modern labor market. They're not going to be able to get good jobs. They're not going to be able to move away out of lower tier informal jobs, for example. So this is another example of why it's important to invest in this kind of programs from right at the very beginning. And finally, policy distortions, well-intentioned. So, the point I think I want to make is that well-intentioned policies can lead to perverse outcomes. That is lack of good jobs. Sometimes policies look very nice, they're very appealing, but they actually have negative outcomes. And policymakers need to reform the overall policy environment, not just a piecemeal approach. They need to see the big picture, the whole thing. How is the whole policy environment working? And often that means difficult choices to be made, and that's not easy. Not easy. I mean, for example, Latin America is trying to do something about the fact that you have this non-contributory social insurance for informal workers. Doing something about that has not been easy, politically very difficult, but has to be done. Has to be done. Otherwise, you're going to solve the good jobs problem. So, just to conclude now, the good jobs problem is one of the most defining policy challenges in the global South. If this is not addressed, millions of workers will be earning precarious livelihoods and be condemned to poverty for many years and perhaps generations. Can lead to political instability, think of the Arab Spring, in already fragile democracies or autocracies. It is possible to do something about it, but needs bold action by both the state and the private sector. So let me end here. Thank you very much to listen to my lecture, and I'm happy to take questions now. I'm going to stop sharing my video so that you don't have to see my screen. Yep, okay, good.
Thank you, Professor Sen. Thank you for this enriching discussion. The floor is open for questions. I would request you to keep your questions short and it will be moderated by us. We will not take more than 2 to 3 questions. So the floor is open. Dr. Sahu may please take over.
Yeah, so I request if anybody has any pointed question, they can unmute and speak or drop on the chat box.
There is one question in the chat box from Professor R. Ramesh. She's asking that where do you think government of India should focus now? I believe it's in the context of jobs and labor market.
That's a very good question, but also a difficult question to answer because there are many things the governments can do, including obviously in the current regime. But the problem really is that you need multifaceted interventions, not just one intervention. So already let's just go back to what I said, the challenges that we are looking at, the reasons we see a deficit of good jobs, right? So one obvious reason is that we are in a globalized world. But my view in globalization is that you don't shy away from it. You don't try to put up trade barriers, but that won't solve the problem. I mean, we know in the Indian case, certainly that has not solved the problem before, right? So you have to embrace globalization and see why is India more competitive in manufacturing, tradable services, and I do not think, therefore, bringing in more protection implicitly or explicitly is the answer. I think India still has a lot of potential in manufacturing. India still has not exploited the global value chains in electronics, garments, and so on. If you look, as I said, compare Bangladesh with India, there's a big difference. So India and electronics, again, why is India not able to compete more in electronics with East Asian producers like Malaysia and Thailand, but also now even Cambodia, for example, and Vietnam. So I think these are important questions of how one can, so that's one part of the story on globalization, embracing globalization and making it work for you, right? The second part of the story, I think, is to do with policy distortions. India has lots of policy distortion. Again, I don't want to get into some of these issues because I think you all know what some of these issues. But India is trying to find a way to remove some of these policy distortions, and it's been difficult. After 1991, there were some major economic reforms, but in my view, they were important, but they were necessary but not sufficient. And the more challenging reforms which are politically difficult have not been done not by any of the administrations we have seen in India since 1991. This has nothing to do with the current regime only. This is a historical problem that we have. So, because India is a democracy, you have to obviously worry about democratic, in a democracy, of course, it's always more challenging perhaps, but, there's no point not to try and do something about it, because all you're really doing is just making the problem worse. We have a major good jobs problem in India, and just over time, the last 30 years or so, there has been no real attempt to do something on the policy distortions in a big way. One specific area that I would just say is labor laws, for example. So then I think that's number two, policy distortions. Number three is on technology. Technology, I'm a bit more optimistic because I think India has some advantages in technology. I do think that digital technology, India can find ways to engage more in tradable services, more than just IT. And I think that's what we've seen post-pandemic with this move into digital technologies. India can actually benefit from that. So now whether that will happen or not depends on the other driver, human capital. And that has been a real challenge. We have just not been able to fix this problem that Lan Pritchett calls schooling ain't learning. Just haven't been able to fix it. Children are in school, but they're not learning very much. And there's another question I think I saw the chat on vocational training. Nothing much has really happened there. And here's where I feel like there should be more attempt on the Indian policy space where the private sector works with the public sector, with the state. I don't think state-run vocational training is the answer. Why? Because state-run vocational training institutions, and we have quite a few of that in India, are not able to understand the modern labor market so quickly. The private sector can. And I think this is where I think India can do more, trying to work with the private sector. Indian governments can do more work with the private sector to try to make sure that those who are getting vocational training have the right kind of skills for the modern labor market. As I said in my presentation, where are the new jobs? They're all in high-skill occupations. The middle-skill occupations, the low-skill occupations, over time with automation are going to go. So if you want to have growth in jobs with a decent work job, well-paid jobs, you have to make sure that there are enough workers who are highly skilled. And that's really a big challenge. This is not only true for India, of course. This is a challenge for other countries in the developing world. And I think this is where India has not done as well as East Asian countries who have done pretty well in this. And that's why East Asia has shown much more stronger, vibrant employment growth in good jobs compared to India and most other South Asian countries and Sub-Saharan Africa. So let me stop here on this question. And I can take a few more, of course.
Thank you, Professor Sen. I request Surjit Sikdar to please unmute and ask his question. Mr. Surjit Sikdar.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to know a few of the definition. I don't know whether I have missed it or not. Number one, what is the definition of good job, in your study? And then what are the upper and lower tier? How these two are defined? And my third and last question is, as a development professional, we always think of, the sustainable employment. And of course, that includes the qualitative as well as the quantity perspective. So where exactly do you suggest us to focus? Should we look at the high paid job, even though, and then probably we'll be missing out the lower strata of the workforce? Or shall we focus on to more into the more number of jobs to be created where quality is not so much, but at least many of the people can get employment?
Yeah, so on the question of, sorry, let me just
yes, sir. Before Mr. I would like to just give you a context of why Surjit is asking this. He works at the Deen Dayal Upadhyay Gramin Kaushal Yojana. So it's DDU-GKY. So that's the context of his question. And I would request Professor Sen to address it, please.
Yeah, I don't know much about this particular programs. I don't want to speak specifically on that. But the question of good jobs is a very good question. What is a good job? A good job is a job that pays well, right? As simple as that. Now, how much pay should be, but pays well, but also is productive. What we don't want is a situation, as we see in the public sector in India, where workers are paid very well, but they're not productive, right? So that's, that's not true for everyone, of course, but certainly we see that in the banking sector. So productivity is important. I totally believe that you have to have highly productive, highly paid jobs. That's good jobs, right? And of course, that's a challenge because, you can pay workers a lot more, but if they're not productive, that doesn't help. Now, so that's the definition. Now, of course, what do you mean by high pay? In India, we already saw in the figure that I presented on the jobs ladder that if you are in formal sector, wage employed, you are significantly paid more than if you are lower tier informal. But I feel that while, of course, you would like to have more workers in the formal sector, and obviously where there are good jobs, I still think there's a big gain to be made by shifting our workers from the lower tier informal to the upper tier informal. Because you saw in the job ladder, that was still substantial, those gains, still substantial. They will double their incomes if they do that. So in my view, the good jobs and challenge in India is not only to get them into formal, but the formal sector is very small in India, but also to move them into upper tier jobs. That's, I think, very important. And this is what I've been trying to argue now, that let's just forget this informal, formal binary, because formal in India is never really going to be that large for quite some time. So, if I'm an informal lower tier worker, not only me, my child, my son or daughter isn't going to get a job in the formal sector. Imagine agricultural labor in India, in a village in India. What's the likelihood? And again, I have some work on this on social mobility that I'll publish also in EPW actually. That what's the likelihood that a worker in the lower tier informal agricultural laborer, his or her daughter or son is going to be in the formal sector? Practically zero, right? Practically zero. Let's just be honest about it. But at least if their son or daughter gets in the upper tier informal, that's still a huge gain for them, right? So I think I don't see good jobs only in the formal sector. And this is where I think what I'm saying may be controversial, but I'm happy to say this, that we have been fetishizing for formal sector in India too much. And we have not thought about how we can transition our lower tier informal workers, whether they're self-employed, whether they're wage employed, to the upper tier of the informal labor market. That should be a very important priority. Not the only priority. We want to see the formal jobs at the jobs increase also, of course, but that should also be a priority. Now, the classification on I don't want to get into the specifics of how we did it in the CPW paper. You have to read the paper. I'm sorry to say that because it will take a lot of time. But we have a fairly clear classification scheme, which we have been using across all the different studies we're doing in this area. And, I mean, you can just guess it's pretty intuitive, right? So let's I'll just take one example. Self-employment. If you are own account or household enterprise without any other person working in your enterprise or from outside, you are a lower tier self-employed, informal self-employed. If you bring somebody from outside, and I've done this work, and anybody who's read my book on informality in India, the OUP book, I hope you all have, because it's really, I mean, we put a lot of effort in getting everything in that one book on what we know about informality in India. There you see what I've been shown is that the moment you bring somebody from outside, what we call NDMEs or DMEs in the categorization in India, there's a big increase in productivity, big increase, right? So that's upper tier. So just very, very, very crudely, even though we are more careful in the PW paper, but just because I wanted to make it clear to you today, if you are a household enterprise, you are an informal, lower tier self-employed. If you are an enterprise employing somebody outside the family, you are upper tier informal self-employed. Formal versus informal is very clear because you have the Factories Act in India. If you're registered the Factories Act, you're formal. If you're not formal. This is a standard Indian definition, as you know. Hope that's clear. If not, please read the EPW paper. Okay, that makes it much more easy.
Professor Sen, the paper is posted in the chat box and some other resources as well. Please use them to access the documents. I would like to. I think Dr. Sahu also has a question. So I would like to request him to unmute and please ask his question. But I also had a very small question. I would like to take this opportunity to ask that. We talked about, I mean, somewhere in your presentation, you talked about the opportunity, the scope of using IHTS data in future to make a kind of a longitudinal study of this. So I was thinking that I have worked with IHTS data for some time, and the sample of IHTS data is extremely small, and the possibility of learning anything under the national average is also very, very limited. So with that data, what are the questions do you think that we can look at out of all these things that you have presented? Because I believe it's a very small sample, number one, and then we cannot do much of the disaggregations that you have shown today, including, in fact, the gender and caste disaggregations. So that's my question to you.
Let me answer your question straight away before Dr. Shah wants to ask a question. But if that's okay, Dr. Shah, can I answer Ruchira's question straight away?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So, I agree with you because IHG's data is not like the National Sample Survey, right? It cannot be. They don't have that kind of resource to do a nationally representative. It is nationally representative, but it's not the same number of observations or same sample size. But the problem is, and I've never understood this, why does not the government of India, the National Statistical Organization, CSO, collect panel data of that kind of size? Why don't they do that? Panel data is essential in economics these days. Without panel data, whether for households, whether for enterprises, you really can't answer many of the questions that we want to answer on some of the things I was talking about, mobility and so on. So the problem in India is there's been no attempt, really systematic attempt, to create panel data, right? And that's why we have to use IHGS. It is still, at least got some amount of, there's 2 rounds, maybe now a third round.
Third is coming out.
Yeah. So I think it's a failure for, historically a failure of the CSO. I hope there's nobody in the CSO here. But there is. I hope they are listening and trying to take some notes.
To tell the truth, we don't even have cross-sectional data at the moment after
Absolutely.
2011.
And I think we have to find a way to start thinking of resurveying the households and the enterprises. So, in India, we have the major sources of data on consumption and employment is the NSS Employment Survey and the Consumption Survey. The major source of information, the informal sector, is unorganized sector service NSS does. At least for a proportion of the ones they interview, they can still go back and interview them again. Right? It's not that difficult these days because nowadays everybody has some mobile phones and you can try. IHGS has done a pretty good job of resurveying. In fact, their attrition rate is pretty low. In fact, I've been told by my colleagues who work on panel data other countries that the attrition rate at IHGS is pretty low. So I do think there is a really big need for panel data in India, exactly the reasons you mentioned, Ruchira, that we don't really have data samples of a large enough size that allows us to answer the kind of question you would like to answer. Okay, Dr. Shah, I'm sorry, that was, but it was a very good question, so I needed to answer it quite quickly. Okay, thank you.
I absolutely agree with Dr. Sahu.
Okay, so I'm surprised you didn't talk about COVID at all, and but new reports are coming from UN organization that SDG 8 is one of the worst affected SDG. Of course, after 1 and 2, but on the one hand, we have this learning loss, skill atrophy, and quantity of employment definitely is going to be a huge challenge, but employability, quality of employment is also going to be a big challenge. So what is the thinking in international think tank, in the boardroom or in the corridor of UN wider Helsinki? What are you talking about these issues?
So you're absolutely right. I didn't talk about COVID. Actually, I have been talking about the COVID in many other presentations, but here I just thought I'd just focus on the question of SDG 8. But of course, COVID has had a huge effect on SDG 8. And in fact, in India, of course, because of the problem is that those who are not able to work, those who need to go to work and cannot work from home, like we can, are the informal sector, and mostly on the lower tier informal sector, street vendors, construction workers, and so on, right? And so when India went into this major lockdown, national lockdown last year, and then of course we have been having regional lockdowns, the other ones have been most badly affected. So the direct effect of lockdowns was clearly seen. We don't have systematic evidence, I would say. I've been looking for systematic evidence, but I haven't seen that because this is the problem of the panel data. If we had baseline data, we could have followed these workers over time. So we don't have, I have not seen very honestly a good a research paper which I feel confident about, that I feel, yes, I think I can believe this paper. But this we know enough in the anecdotal evidence, right? That workers in farms that have been very badly affected. The other problem, I think, and this is something for a wake-up call for any government in South Asia and Africa, is that they never took the informal sector very seriously, and then this happened. Is there going to be a change in the way they see the informal sector, informal workers? Will there be a new social contract? Will we attempt to make sure this doesn't happen again? Because who knows what might be the future, new pandemics or whatever it is. Because the way this workers suffered in India, especially last year when there was a national lockdown, as we all know what happened there. I hope that there is a realization by governments at state and national level that this cannot happen again. We need to do something about it, right? So I hope this is an opportunity for our policymakers to make sure that this is not going to happen again, because these workers are and still are been very badly affected by the pandemic, and we have had social protection schemes that have been brought in, but really speaking, how much have they helped? We still don't know, right? Because of the problem reaching out to the informal sector. Right? In fact, I've been arguing that most of what we see, both in India and elsewhere, are kind of almost targeted the formal sector. We haven't seen, I mean, the only way we do cash transfers and so on, but we haven't seen a kind of a generalized attempt to support the informal sector post in the pandemic situation. And actually, just as because you mentioned it, we are producing a book on this issue, on COVID and informality. This is being done with WeGo, probably know WeGo, and who work a lot with SEO and others. So we're doing something of that, not only for India, of course, but also for other countries, because this particular issue is not only an India problem. Same thing was observed in Africa and also in Latin America, right? And so hopefully, what I would like to see is it's a wake-up call that we need to do something more than is just providing some kind of cash transfers or whatever. Those are fine, but that's not, you need to fundamentally alter the relationship state and informal workers, which is what I meant by new social contract. Now, whether that will happen or not, we'll have to see. It will not happen immediately, I think, but I hope that there will be understanding that we have to do something about this.
Thank you, Professor Sen. I think there are no more questions in the chat box. Professor Sahu, I think we believe we should close if there are no more questions.
Yeah.
Okay, so with this concluding remark from Professor Sen, that we should move beyond palliative cures and just start looking for something new social contract after this pandemic. We can close our program here today. And I would like to thank Professor Sen for taking out. He has given us more time than he thought that he would be able to give us, and has stayed with us for this whole hour. Thank you, sir. Thank you for your time. And I also thank all my attendees, invitees who have stayed here patiently and engaged with us, our students who are listening to this. All the resources that Professor Sen has mentioned today will be shared with you, and including the presentation that sir has presented here today. We will also release the video shortly so that you can again go over the presentation. So with this, let us close the program. And Dr. Partha, if you have anything else to add, please.
I'd just like to thank again Professor Sen for accepting our invitation, and a lot of questions came out from his presentation. So hope we will pick up few, including the COVID one, and we will do some work and we will share with you, sir. Thank you very much again. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sahu, Dr. Ruchira. Actually, I remember I'd been to an IRD many years back. I forget now which year it was.
2016.
2016, that's right, yes.
I was also there, yeah.
Yes, I hope that it was a very pleasant visit. So when travel starts again, hope to be there to visit an IRD. And
absolutely, sir.
Yeah.
Sure.
I can promise that I will do that.
Agree.
I had a very nice time when I was there. Thank you so much. The last thing I want to just say quickly is that, if there's anything that you need to know, any other resources, maybe not write to me directly, because my email inboxes are very cluttered these days. But Dr. Shahu, and maybe he can communicate to me, and I can send anything else that might be
Sure,
useful.
sure,
Very happy to
sure.
do that. Yeah.
Great, great.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank
Okay.
you so
Thank
much.
you. Yeah. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, sir.